In this advanced module about composition, we're going to learn a few key factors about wide-angle photography, telephoto photography, focus stacking, using foreground elements. There's a lot to uncover inside this module, but we're going to start basic and progressively work ourselves a little bit harder. So right now I want to talk about wide-angle photography. This is generally in full frame terms, 16mm to 35mm equivalent. It can obviously be 14mm, so anything around that is wide angle. Before that is classified as ultra wide angle. Today we're going to start very basic and very simple. We're going to shoot this lesson for wide angle photography and the next lesson, telephoto photography at the same beautiful scene here. The reason behind that is I want to show the differences in focusing, what we want to try and get in the composition in our scene, where to focus, our settings in camera, to understand what's different and what we're basically looking for when capturing the image. Now for this image, I haven't got really any foreground element. That is on purpose because later down the line inside this module, we're going to get into focus stacking and also using foreground elements. So I want to take out that little bit of a harder, more difficult factor inside of this lesson and just concentrate on what we're photographing in this scene. Now, generally, when photographing wide-angle photography, it's a lot easier to start off with, and that is generally why people get into wide-angle photography in landscape and nature photography when they first start. The reason behind that is the composition speaks for itself. We can photograph a big, beautiful scene like we are right now and fit everything inside of the composition. And secondly, when we focus, it's a lot easier to grab focus on something because our field of view is really, really wide. We don't have to worry about a focusing point inside the image. Although it is crucial, if we do make a mistake, it's generally a lot easier. Also, getting onto the exposure module, when we photograph with a wide angle, we've got deep shadows, bright highlights. So we've got that wider field of view once again. It's a lot easier to put all the exposure or all the amount of light into the sensor to capture a more dynamic image compared to a telephoto. But we're going to get onto that a little bit more. So what I'm going to do now is set my camera settings up. And we want to work on that exposing to the right again. But before we get into the exposing to the right, we want to go 160 ISO to lower that noise. We want to go to f8 for that aperture to give a really big depth of field. And also we want to make sure that we're focusing. So I've got the village in front of me here and the mountains in the background, but due to focus peaking, when I focus on the middle part of the frame, I'm getting everything in focus. Once again, that's because of wide angle photography, it's a lot easier to focus. Now I want to muck around with the shutter speed to work out the histogram that we're exposing to the right. So currently, when I'm on f8 160 ISO, if I go to 1/10, maybe even just a little bit more to 1/8, I'm exposing to that right-hand side perfectly for this image. And when I look on the left-hand side of the histogram, I'm not crushing any blacks. That means I'm getting all the exposure, the dynamic range inside of one image. So now I can go through and put a 2-second timer on and just capture that image. That is how simple it is to use wide angle photography. Now we are going to get a little bit more difficult, as I said, with using foreground elements and focus stacking. But when you're first starting out, it's really good to shoot to that 16mm and 35mm when we're first starting out with our nature and landscape photography. Telephoto photography in nature and landscape photography. What are the key aspects that we need to be looking for in the composition, and what are the best camera settings to use to capture those zoomed images? Now on the previous lesson, we were out at the same scene photographing but with wide angle photography. In wide angle photography, as you seen in the last lesson, we capture the whole entire composition. When the viewer views that image, no questions need to be asked because they can see the entire scene in front of them. But when we move on to a zoomed lens, we have to basically flip that completely around and just focus on key aspects inside the scene. So today I'm focusing just on the church in front of me and one of the highest mountains in the country that I'm photographing in. And we're going to be concentrating on just these two elements inside the composition. Because in the composition module, I explained to you about focus stacking, using light, using scale for our images. And that is what I'm going for right now. Unfortunately, we're just losing the light right now, but I've got scale of the church. Everyone knows how big a church, or roughly how big a church is, but the mountains are almost 3,000 meters. So we want to try and portray that in our telephoto photography. So right now I've got a zoom lens on, shooting in landscape orientation. So the best settings that you want to use are the same settings that we use for all our landscape images. The lowest ISO, so 160 for me, f8, around that f8 to f11 aperture, and then we're going to determine our shutter speed that we've done throughout this entire duration of this course. So for me right now, shooting at f8 and also 160 ISO, I'm getting around 1/4 seconds. So you can see the light is really dissipated right now. But what I want to compare to you also is not just about the scene, but also how we put our camera on the tripod. And I'm going to explain it to you right now. Because what we try and do in telephoto photography is get less mess in the image. And that's what I want to explain to you today. Trying to get the most zoom and the less questions that people can answer. So we want someone to look at this image and ask basically what is around and what is to the left, what is to the right. So when I set my camera up in landscape orientation and try and take an image, you can see it's going to cut off the top and also bottom of the image. You can see right now. This is just for display purpose. Obviously, I'll have to change lenses, zoom out a little bit, but to the left and right hand side of me, I've got so much empty space. So what we're going to do right now is flip this into portrait orientation, because that was shooting at 55mm for me. But what I want to try and do now is zoom in as far as I possibly can and just put the church at the bottom and the mountain clipping in the top. Trying to use those rule of thirds, but we may break this rule right now. So I'm going to zoom all the way in, and you can see 55mm before, now we're almost 90mm, completely different what we're trying to get at. So if we had some light, this would be an absolutely beautiful image. Now we're going to shoot that f8 160 ISO, and that is giving me a 1/26 at f8. So I can go ahead and just get this composition down packed. So I'm trying to put the church all the way to the bottom of the frame and then leaving about 1/5 of the sky, because there's not a lot of color in the sky right now. So I'm going to go ahead and take that single image to show you right now with a 2-second timer. This is very, very important when we're shooting with telephoto, because when we're shooting with a wide angle like we did in the previous lesson, at f9 we've got a really big depth of field. But because our depth of field is a lot smaller here, I want to focus on the subject, which is the church. So I'm focusing on the church. But because we are zooming in, so around that 100mm, anytime I touch the tripod, it's going to make those movements really, really big. So we want to make sure we've either got a 2-second timer or even a 10-second timer put into your camera. So now when I go to push that trigger on a 2-second timer, it's going to wait 2 seconds, the tripod is going to go completely still, and then take the image. That is very, very important. So here is that image you can see right now that we've just taken. You can see the difference between shooting from landscape and vertical. What we're trying to do here is not trying to shoot vertical or not trying to shoot landscape. As I said, we're trying to get rid of all this outside material inside of our composition and focus on just 2 or 3 simple elements. So we're actually trying to make the image very minimalistic. So wide angle, we want to try and tell the whole story. With zoomed or telephoto photography, we want to try and tell only part of the story. That is the best way I can describe telephoto photography. Now, don't be annoyed if you do go out and try and fail with telephoto photography. It took me almost 2 years to start to understand and grasp the understanding of how to photograph with telephoto photography. But the best thing you can do is start, because once you go out, you're going to start seeing compositions completely different to capturing with telephoto photography, and it's going to set your photography completely apart.